What's up, everybody? Gotta back up. Take five. Here we go. Cutting the rambling. I'm cutting the reading from my research paper directly and not from my presentation script, because that's 36 pages that you just don't want to hear from. It's a lot of stuff. So my paper, essentially, Shakespeare and Marlow as major contributors to depth psychology. I know. Shakespeare and Marlow as psychologists, Adam. Get the hell out of here. Well, depth psychologists aren't exactly psychologists in the connotation of today is sort of strict materialists, scientists, and that sort of thing. Although psychologists can deviate and will oftentimes, especially clinical psychologists, because they have no choice but to. Because now you're dealing with the complex substructures, psychic structures that cannot be seen but must be sort of dealt with, approached behaviorally, slash, cognitively or intellectually or creatively, right? Well, what does that mean? That means there's a lot more to humans than physics, essentially, or chemistry, or biology, right? There's a lot more than that. There's essentially, all that stuff that makes up the more than that is what Jung would call the psyche. Nietzsche would call it the soul. Freud would call it the psychic forces, although he's still stuck to the idea that psychic forces are phenomenological representations of biological forces. So Freud, doing his best to resurrect depth psychology as a science, aka psychoanalysis, had no other choice but to stick to a Newtonian materialist sort of paradigm, right? In order to be taken seriously. But of course, it helps to note that his development of psychoanalysis, well, he wasn't the one who developed it, it was Nietzsche, but he's the one who made it a science. And he also Freud, we're talking here, also came from the background of a physician and a neurologist, and then sort of it was hypnosis and the study of hypnosis and observing uh, patients undergoing hypnosis that led him to psychoanalysis, and that's important to know. But this is in the psychology class, so moving on to Shakespeare. So we're going to be discussing here uh, a brief overview of psychoanalysis, just as quick as possible, just to get you guys caught up with definitions of terms and what it means. An attempt to contextualize Shakespeare and Marlowe's work in psychoanalytic terminology, Shakespeare's myth, and then Romeo and Juliet through the depths. So in the end, I'm only going to be reading one text that I actually discussed in my research paper. Why? For time purposes. I think I'm already past a minute, and I haven't even actually started talking about what I discussed in my paper. So here we go. My opinion, I successfully sort of supported the evidence that it is the case that they are depth psychologists, um, and that depth psychology belong to the dramatists and the artists, because that's what they're exploring essentially, with these recurring patterns that we see in stories. Jung calls them archetypal, well, archetypes are essentially are what the characters represent. Well, we see characters oftentimes over and over again. The hero, for an example, or the tyrannical ruler, or the mother, or the the evil bad guy who's dressed in black, or with a twirly mustache and a black hat, etc. Those are all archetypes. The wise old man is an archetype. The the energetic child hero, right? It's another archetype. And then there's also archetypal motifs, like sort of Jesus coming to save a village or something like that. His village, that's sort of an archetypal motif, and we see that for an example in Avengers, the newest one, Endgame, right? Tony Stark returning from the dead, returning from space uh, to save the world from extinction, aka Thanos. Um, we see Dr. Faustus in Age of Ultron. Uh, there's a lot of, there's a lot actually. You can find a lot of archetypal motifs and archetypes in the Marvel movies, which largely lends to the evidence again that that's why they're so successful. It also lends to the evidence that that's why Shakespeare and Marlowe have been around as long as they have been. So for Carl Jung, wherever symbols existed, our unconscious has been speaking to us through those symbols and the mythological stories that surround them. Depth psychology partly comprises of psychoanalysis and its different variants, though not the only function of the experience of depth, has been understood as primarily just been developed by Sigmund Freud. Although Carl Jung was his protege, elaborated on Freud's ideas of id, ego, and superego, conscious, unconscious, preconscious, and other concepts, bridging the gap between further biological phenomena and psychological phenomena. Many interpretations deviated in small and large increments from Freud's ideas. Further back to the Greeks, Plato's cave allegory represented a notion that there could be deeper truths than what our senses permit us to be conscious of. Plato, this would represent imperfect copies of perfect absolute forms in a higher realm. Psyche in Greek means soul, mind, or spirit. Fast forward a few centuries, Carl Jung believed in an unconscious and collective unconscious, both making up different layers of the psyche which exist outside of space time, or at least our conscious experience of it. That's sort of a Kantian idea there from Immanuel Kant. You find it in a Critique of Pure Reason. Uh, Wholeness consists in the union of conscious and the unconscious personality. Explore this notion a bit further into history. We find that Plato shared a similar idea to the depth psychologist. Plato's cave allegory represented the notion that there could be deeper truths than what our senses permit us to be conscious of. For Plato, this world represented imperfect copies of perfect absolute forms of higher realm. Fast forward a few centuries, Carl Jung believed in the unconscious, conscious and unconscious both making up different layers of the psyche, which exists. Sorry, the uniqueness of the psyche can never enter wholly into reality. It can only be realized approximately. It still remains the absolute basis of all consciousness. The deeper layers of the psyche lose their individual uniqueness as they retreat farther and farther into darkness. Lower down, as they approach autonomous functional systems, they become increasingly collective until they are universalized and extinguished in the body's materiality, i.e., chemical substances. The body's carbon is simply carbon. Hence, at bottom, the psyche is simply world. In other words, the unconscious speaks in its own language, and that's something to note. I'm just trying to understand. The hell. Sorry. Here's a little timeline for you there. Something like that. It's not completely accurate because shortened into 5 stages of development, but essentially that's what the Mesopotamians are doing too. Whenever you're writing story that catches what Stephen Greenblatt would call social energy, or what would it catch social energy? Sort of somewhat contagious, right? It catches steam, like the Marvel movies, which I like to refer to as a modernized example of Shakespearean plays. Well, they literally have had that Shakespearean play in one of the movies, right? Thor, the second one, where there's sort of that play where uh, Loki is cloaked as Odin, he's dying or something like that. Um, I mean, it's there, man. It's Captain America descending up rather than down. The three helicarriers to retrieve his beloved Bucky Barnes, aka Beatrice, from the lowest depths of hell. Um, yeah, there are endless archetypal motifs there. Um, in other words, the unconscious speaks its own language. Thus, for Nietzsche, in order to be able to live, the Greeks were obliged to create their gods out of the deepest necessity. For Jung, myths are original revelations of the preconscious psyche, involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings, and anything but allegories of physical processes. Myth originate function to satisfy um, the psychological need for contact with the unconscious. All three primary contributors to depth psychology understood that there existed within us precortex, rational thought, one of complex psychic systems out of which springs much of the phenomena that makes up what makes us human beyond our physiology, myths, stories, ideologies, meanings, beliefs, culture, which ultimately fabricate the context within which our behaviors and experiences are understood. Uh, Such a discipline rejects the Newtonian paradigm of pure materialism. Depth psychology also refuses the Hobbesian paradigm, built around the assumption that humans are extremely simple, predictably anxious creatures We must be governed, and thus government and political slash economical uh, standards of examination slash thought or dictate the human experience. Basically, politics and economics keep everything superficial. It's the antithesis to depths, right? Depths, everything under that, everything under the superficial, everything beyond what we experience. Sort of representation of psychic happenings, everything beyond the fire, right? In the allegory of the cave, something like that. Solutions never sought to establish Shakespeare and Marlow as important contributors to the field of psychology, as well as extract further meaning from their texts, from Jungian texts, and from Jungian texts through psychological interpretation of Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and Dr. Faustus. Hamlet and Dr. Faustus won't be discussed here, although I will be discussing Dr. Faustus somewhat loosely in the discussion at the end, if I have time, seeking to better understand. I gotta keep moving back and forth here. Seeking to better understand what he called Renaissance modes of aesthetic empowerment, historicist Stephen Greenblatt examined the ways in which cultural objections, expressions, practices, mainly Shakespeare's plays, assume such compelling force. Quoting the Greeks, he named his force energia, or social energy, and socio-historical physical force. In his attempt to understand the social energy, Greenblatt suggests that we cannot measure the phenomenon of social energy itself by its effects. In other words, social energy is manifested in the capacity of certain verbal, oral, and visual traces to produce, shape, and organize collective physical and mental experiences. Hence, it is associated with respectable forms of pleasure and interest, with the capacity to arouse, disquiet, pain, and fear, pity, laughter, tension, relief, and wonder. Furthermore, Greenblatt defines an aesthetic form which carries a social energy as being characterized by its capacity for minimal adaptability along time, as a measurement of external change. So, minimal adaptability means the lack of necessity to change it to fit the new generation slash framework of our reality, right? And that's important to note that changes over time. For some, it might not be quite obvious, but should be, right? Just in daily conversations, you realize, um, yeah, back in my day, da 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 da, that wouldn't exist if everything stayed static, right? Thus, sorry, got to change slides here. I'm reading and then also uh, going back to the presentation. As an object that carries social energy also carries a survivability across changes in social circumstances, cultural values, and changes in beliefs and paradigms. Whereas most collective expressions move from their original setting to a new place or time or dead on arrival, the social energy encoded in some works of art continues to generate the illusions of life for centuries. This Greenblatt states must harbor an extreme powerful energy, and although Greenblatt does not explicitly agree with the psychologists on how our two Renaissance dramatists came to their works, he does go on to focus on the socio-historical aspects of Shakespeare's play in his book, Shakespearean Negotiations. That's the text if anyone wants to look it up. Carl Jung would agree that Shakespearean plays rose out of our depths, our collective or his individual depths. Uh, Shakespeare's, but they came out of him and would only be partly attributed to external events. In other words, his plays are projected out of his unconscious as a story comprised of symbolic representations of a psychic world rather than a representation of his external world, although the two can be tightly correlated. That again sort of alludes to the primary system of thought and the secondary system. The primary system being the unconscious system. That's sort of what we experience in our dreams. That's what we experience when we're children before we develop executive functions. That's what we experience largely when we're, on hopped up on psychoactive substances, whether it be alcohol, cannabis, psychedelics, etc. This explains archetypal motifs repeated from biblical stories. For Freud, dreams also represent a collection of somatic stimuli translated to dream content. Three kinds of somatic stimuli will be distinguished: the objective sensory stimuli, which proceed from external objects, the inner states of excitation of the sensory organs, having only a subjective reality, and the bodily stimuli arising within the body. We have also noticed that the writers on dreams are inclined to thrust into the background any psychic sources of dreams which may operate simultaneously with the somatic stimuli. So that's Freud, 245, in Freudian collections. Insofar as its creation is guided by the unconscious, it intentionally seeks to reveal the unconscious. For Jung, the unconscious seeks to communicate in presence consciousness to consciousness as clearly as possible. So the primary system communicating the secondary system. They sort of work in tangent. This was a Freudian idea, but of course we see that in Nietzsche too. It is not, as for Freud, speak in code to elude detection. It simply speaks in its own distinct language. Furthermore, Jung believed that the myths allow us to access our unconscious. Fantasies are the natural expressions of the life of the unconscious. The fact that an idea so utterly archaic could rise to such exalted heights of meaning only points to the vitality of archetypal ideas. It demonstrates the rightness of principle that the archetype, because of its power to unite opposites, mediates between the unconscious substratum and the conscious mind. In other words, we experience our unconscious psychic events through the myths that come out of us. Jung saw the evidence of the provided statements in innate primordial ubiquitous distribution of myths across primitive tribes in different regions of the planet, and for whom there exists little evidence to suggest that they have ever met. Behind this evidence, along with the repeated characters and motifs throughout the stories humans have told since the beginning, establish the concept of myth as innate psychic phenomena, archetyped as the collective unconscious as a scientific understanding. And now we get to examine Romeo and Juliet. There are two ways to read Romeo and Juliet through Jungian lens. It plays about two people in their youth on a path towards individuation, but fail as a consequence of anxiety towards existence. It plays about two people overcome by an unshakable desire to return to the unconscious. And I apologize for maybe misreading. Again, I'm not the best at reading Shakespeare or articulating or extracting sort of meaning in exactly the right words. Maybe just try and absorb the aroma of what I'm saying and not exactly. This dichotomy may prove false, however. The dichotomy of the two lenses or methods of reading Romeo and Juliet through a Jungian lens, however, seeing as how the individuation process, separating oneself from one's unconscious and also separating oneself from their ego, eventually binding the two to become whole, is part of the developmental process of the psyche, which concludes its journey by returning to its unconscious from whence it came. Thus, the two ways become one, and Shakespeare projects Jungian psychology centuries before Jung's arrival. Um, and I really think there's enough evidence for that. There's actually, in my opinion, there's a surplus of evidence. It's sort of somewhat overwhelming and quite exciting. I am too sore and pierced with his shaft to soar with his light feathers, and so bound I cannot bound a pitch above dull woe. Under love's heavy burden do I sink, as love a tender thing is too rough, too rude, too boisterous, and it pricks like thorn. There's a war between Dionysus and Apollo that Nietzsche alludes to multiple times in the birth of tragedy, and look, Apollo was unable to live without Dionysus. That's Apollo is essentially the conscious secondary system. Dionysus is essentially the unconscious primary system. And now we sort of see where Freud gained influence for his quote unquote creation. Consciousness, though having overcome the great darkness of our unconscious, still requires what it had overcome in order to exist in harmony. We also see here how ideas develop, right? So we see these concepts. It's essentially Romeo and Juliet, Apollonian, Dionysian, in one sense, in a Nietzschean frame. We see from Jung that it's a little deeper than that. For Nietzsche, the Greek gods overcame the Titans as Apollo had to overcome Dionysus. For Jung as well, God in the story of Adam and Eve represents the story of our coming to be, not quite physically but consciously, for God had to overcome the darkness. Jung calls this recurring pattern in stories archetypal motifs. The hero's main feat is to overcome the monster of darkness. It is the long hoped for and expected triumph of consciousness over the unconscious. Although we must all return to the unconscious according to Jung, a desire for an early, that's sort of his idea of death, in a sense. For an early return represents a fear of living, desire to return to the unconscious, sort of a Jungian interpretation of, well, a desire to not live or to never grow up. It's sort of kind of the Peter Pan story. It's also, well, it's the Romeo and Juliet story. Um, That would be the first part of the tragedy. The second part would be what Jung called the dangers of transference. A large part of the individuation process is balancing out of psychic forces. Jung, each aspect of the psyche contains an equally important counterforce. He called these phenomena syzygies. Sorry, SYZYGIS. I should have written it down. The yin yang concept of duality in all things. Too strong an ego reflects one's severance from the recognition of their unconscious. The goal in the second half of life is conserving previous values together with the recognition of their opposites. This means that the individuals have to develop neglected aspects of their personality. Of course, that means that the first half of life is what? Developing one's ego, in a sense. Uh, building a sense of self. That's the ego, the persona. Within every man exists the anima archetype, and within every woman the animus. A man's animus serves to balance out typical masculine traits with the feminine and forming a fully conscious, unified being. In these words, the anima is a factor of the utmost importance in the psychology of a man, wherever emotions and effects are at work. She intensifies, exaggerates, falsifies, and mythologizes all emotional relations with his work and with other people of both sexes. The resultant fantasies and entanglements are all her doing. When the animal is strongly constellated, she softens the man's character and makes him touchy, irritable, moody, jealous, vain, and unadjusted. He is then in a state of discontent and spreads discontent all around him. Shakespeare explores our innate tendency to anthropomorphize our world based on our mood, thus illustrating the power of moods and unconscious projection. Um, Number one, a fear of existence. Number two, failure to individuate slash unconscious transference. The two are tightly associated. It's two ways of looking at the same neurotic function. Tears argumenting the fresh morning's dew reflects the power of Romeo's melancholy. Romeo's melancholy, Nietzsche and Jung would argue, stems from a resistance towards life, a failure to embrace life, leading one to a type of paralysis of existence, where they are neither alive nor dead, but trapped in a zombie-like state. Romeo adds to clouds more clouds. Mind creates more darkness. Yeah, so it's kind of the Peter Pan idea. It's the idea that, well, if you never act in accordance with the developmental processes that are required of you, and there certainly are, there's that sort of developmental psychology established that you don't have to age, or sort of you don't have to grow up, right? You don't have to live your life. Basically, you can just be young forever. Of course, that's a lie. It's not true. That's just one way of looking at it. His mind creates more darkness. Away from light steals home. The light dark contrast is repeated throughout the play, and others. Wants to fill the daylight out, makes himself artificial night. Romeo attempts to escape consciousness by hiding away in the dark. The night is reserved for our unconscious to become active. Uh, yeah. Dionysus is the god of intoxication and rapture. While Apollo light is associated with visible form, concept of knowledge and moderation, Dionysus dark is linked to formless flux, mystical intuition, and excess. While the Apollonian conscious world is one of distinct individuals, the Dionysian world is one where these separate individual identities have been dissolved and human beings find themselves reconciled with the elemental energies of nature. Through Dionysus, the unconscious will become part of a single living being with whose joy in eternal creation we are fused. That's the Nietzsche Reader, page 34, by Pearson and Pearson and Lorch. Sorry. So we see here, upon his cousin's greetings, Romeo replies, "This is a day so young." Out of Romeo springs his resentment in the form of a simple question. Sort of, one might see that as a Freudian slip. Resentment out of a confusion towards conscious existence. Why is Romeo confused? His ability to contextualize his experiences has been tossed asunder by the disruption of a sense, of a homeostasis. This came from the sort of rejection of a woman who he thinks he loves, and well, that's not uncommon. That's actually quite common. Rejection by women, by men, any kind of betrayal, breakups, any kind of tragedy can really disrupt someone's sense of reality, and that's sort of what we're seeing in one sense through Romeo. How long must I persist in a state of consciousness? As Romeo. So that's like a literal sort of a little too obvious there. As we'll see in Hamlet and Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, as I saw, you guys won't see. The problem of consciousness can cause and is caused by suffering. So suffering is a big thing there. Although the issue with that is that, well, there's unconscious suffering as well, and I would argue that unconscious suffering is way worse because conscious suffering you can do something about it. Um, that's why you become conscious of it. Sort of the idea that in demonology of you become aware of a demon's name, you learn a demon's name, and you can command it. You learn that you find out the source of your neuroses. You can change it. You can command it in a sense, and it no longer possesses you. Um, in other words, suffering is a primary consequence of consciousness. Yeah, suffering is there. Suffering is sort of comes with the territory of existence, of conscious existence. But um, like I said, unconscious uh, or less conscious people suffer too. Part two is similar but also distinct. Romeo's unconscious projection and transference first onto this woman who rejects his advances, and then Juliet's part two and is both a consequence. I think Rosaline, if I'm wrong, if I'm not wrong, which I probably am. The cause of part one is the anxiety of conscious existence. The Greek Silenus knew and felt the terrors and horrors of existence. In order to be able to live at all, he had to use the brilliant Olympians, born of dreams, as a screen. That great mistrust of the titanic powers of nature, those ruthless Moira ruling over all knowledge, that vulture of the great friend of man, Prometheus, that fearful fate of the wise Oedipus, that curse on the house of Atrides, which drove Orestes to matricide. In short, that whole philosophy of the forest god, together with mythical examples on which the melancholy Etruscans foundered, was continually overcome anew, in any case veiled and removed from view by the Greeks through that artistic middle world of the Olympians. In order to be able to live, the Greeks were obliged to create the gods out of the deepest necessity. And that's the Nietzsche Reader, page 50. All heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of all seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick hell. That's Romeo there. Here we see Romeo's confusion, his fear of existence, the projection of his anima onto the woman he encounters. And to the women he encounters, sorry. Sometimes a man's relationship to the woman who has caught his anima accounts for the existence of a syndrome. And that's Jung, the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, page 70 to 71. There's a chance it might not be on the right slide here. Romeo's misshapen cast of all seeming forms reflects his fascination and grievance with the lure of his unconscious, as well as the discontent caused by his projected animal onto his rejecting suitor. Probably showing a sentence. Romeo desires the unconscious, and he will do anything to return to comfortable non-existence. As a consequence, he's also fascinated with the concepts of his unconscious, which are projected outward onto the women of his fascination. Hence, he associates his woman ideal, with a return to the unconscious. Shakespeare and Romeo confirms this theory in the following monologue: associated with love, with darkness, and negative emotion. The confirming Romeo's projection. Why such is love? Transgression, griefs of mine own lie heavy in my breast, which thou wilt propagate to have it pressed with more of thine. This love that thou hast shown doth add more grief to too much of my own. Romeo's perception has been smoke screened by the outer projection of his unconscious contents. Dark and twisted from whatever set of phenomena and or repression of said phenomena over time sent them into being. Romeo's unconscious content is indeed filled with darkness, chaos, the will to self-destruction. This neurosis leads to what Jung calls a change in internal structure. This change in personality causes a structural alteration. Jung associates with the phenomena of possession. So there we see that term possession again. Possession is often used in psychoanalysis to describe what repressed um, psychic forces or energies or ideas do to the individual once they are sort of buried down into the depths of their unconscious. Some content and idea part of the personality obtains mastery of the individual. The contents which thus take possession appear as peculiar convictions, idiosyncrasies, stubborn plans, etc. As a rule, they are not open to correction. Once one has to be especially good friends with the possessed person to deal with such a condition. Possession can be formulated as an identity of the ego personality with a complex. Sorry. The inferior function is practically identical with the dark side of the human personality. The darkness which clings to every personality is the door into the unconscious, the gateway of dreams, from which those two twilight figures, the shadows and the animals, step into our nighty visions, or, remaining invisible, take possession of our ego consciousness. A man who is possessed by a shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into traps, whenever possible, he prefers to make an unfavorable impression on others. And that's Jung, Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, page 123. Said I have lost myself, I'm not here, this is not Romeo, some other where. That's Romeo speaking there. Sort of an example, prime example, shown Romeo and Juliet. A sick man, sadness makes his will. That's another good example there, I thought. And in fact, the theory of all psychoneurotic symptoms culminates in one proposition that they, too, must be conceived as wish fulfillments of the unconscious. And this is Freud here. The guardian preconscious is then overpowered. The unconscious excitation subdue the preconscious. And from the preconscious, they dominate our speech and actions, or they enforce hallucinatory regressions, thus directing an apparatus not designed for them by virtue of the attraction exerted by perceptions on the distribution of our psychic energy. We call this condition psychosis. So psychosis is essentially possession of the repressed unconscious psychic force. If that makes any sense. Yeah, we're a long way away from take your Prozac and get the hell out of my office. This will, to our own destruction, desire to return to the comfort of non-existence, to our unconscious, exists in all of us, and it's largely what the three plays discussed here are about. That is the ribbon that binds the plays together. Sort of the idea that we all have our shadow, and in that shadow is uh, the, the threat of extinction, of our own extinction. When Silenus finally fell into his hands, the king asked him, "What is the very best and most preferable of all things for man?" This is Nietzsche. The stiff and motionless demon refused to speak until, forced by the king, he finally burst into shrill laughter and uttered the following words: "Miserable, ephemeral race, children of chance and toil, why do you force me to tell you what is best for you not to hear? The very best of all things is completely beyond your reach, not to have been born, not to be nothing. The second best thing for you is to meet an early death. Now the Olympian magic mountain opens itself up to us, as it were, and shows us its roots. The Greeks knew and felt the terrors and horrors of existence. In order to be able to live at all, you have to use the brilliant Olympians born of dream as a screen." That's a passage that I just read. There's some cool art that I thought was somewhat uh, correlated with the passage. Relevance. Let's talk why it matters. Yeah, why do we have today all the knowledge to bolster our secondary systems of thought, aka rationalism. Uh, though we seem to have lost something along the way, perhaps this is connection to our unconscious and methods once innately relied upon for such regular communication to take place. That was religion. That was sort of our primordial rituals, all the crazy shit our ancestors used to do. We work more, we know more, we sleep less, we take more stimulants. As a consequence, we stimulate ourselves more with anything and everything on the internet. We're constantly working within the framework of secondary systems. That's our sort of, I guess, upper abstracting methodologies, for economics and business and science and all that stuff. As the Industrial Revolution blasts off quite literally into space. This direction, though not necessarily a bad thing, may have its consequences. A severance from our roots, our unconscious mythological roots, as it were, our primordial roots. Might call it the Faustian age, one might call it. We have all the knowledge and all the megalomania that comes with it. Our egos, massive ego inflation everywhere. We judge for ourselves whether humanity is good or bad instead of letting God judge. We consume at rates unheard of. We can twirl our fingers about on a screen and food, and or a new car arrives at our doorstep within hours. If that's not godlike power, I don't know what is. Although I did not get to cover Faust, it would have taken an hour or more. Or Romeo and Juliet was a little shorter. Romeo and Juliet exemplifies the accuracy and unconscious wisdom of our depths that Shakespeare and Marlow were able to project out onto our popular plays. I would go further and argue that this is the reason they became popular and remain popular. They contain, so that's sort of alluding to Greenblatt's social energy concept. That's the reason they had social energies, because the Jungian, uh, you know, uh, archetypal motifs that they inhabit and archetypes that they inhabit and project successfully and effectively. They contain within mythological representations of archetypal forces and motifs within our unconscious. That's why they reach out and grab us through time. Clinical psychoanalytic practice was still a long way from development, but if uh, I'm forced to wonder if, had Romeo and Juliet access to Jung or even Nietzsche, would their fates been any different? Or was the play a crucial pillar to the foundations of what would one day be called death psychology? Of course, Romeo and Juliet were fictional characters, but they, gosh, what would Shakespeare have written how would Shakespeare have written it differently had he read Nietzsche first, or how he had he read Jung first, if Jung and Nietzsche preceded Shakespeare, although I don't think it's possible that way. If I think if Jung and Shakespeare and Nietzsche would have preceded Shakespeare, they would have been Shakespeare. But they didn't write in a way that is publicly accessible, right? Shakespeare is publicly accessible. That's why it caught on. And Jung is sort of a cult like person, and Nietzsche is even lesser so. He's a well, no pun intended, but he pertains to a very small niche of philosophers, even in the philosophy department, who are willing to spend time reading and trying to understand his writings. So maybe that question is not as relevant as I thought when I wrote it down. And that's my project, guys. Thanks for listening, and if you made it through, I'll give you a lollipop if I see you again. Thanks.